The night my mother handed me a dress and told me to look presentable, I thought we were going to dinner. I was 22 years old. I'd just come home from a double shift at the diner where I'd been working since I was 17. My feet hurt. My hair smelled like fryer oil. And my mother was standing at the door of my childhood bedroom holding a dress I had never seen before. Navy blue, conservative, the kind of thing you'd wear to a job interview at a law firm. With an expression on her face I couldn't quite read. Not happiness. Not sadness. Something in between. Something I now recognize as the look of a person who has already made a decision and is too far in to reverse it. She said, "Put this on. We're having company tonight." I didn't ask questions. That's the thing I want you to understand first. I didn't ask questions because in my family, you didn't ask questions. You just moved in the direction you were pointed and hoped it led somewhere safe. It didn't. What happened that night, and in the weeks and months that followed, dismantled everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and what it means to be owned by the people who are supposed to love you. I'm going to tell you all of it. From the beginning. My name is Sarah. Not short for anything, just Sarah. My parents named me that because my mother had been reading a novel when she was pregnant, and she liked how it sounded. I grew up in a small city in western Pennsylvania. The kind of place that used to have industry and doesn't anymore. Old steel country, faded storefronts, houses with good bones but no money to maintain them. The kind of place where people stay not because they love it but because leaving takes resources most of them don't have. There were 4 of us in the house where I grew up. My mother, Diane. My father, Gerald. My older brother, Kevin, who was 5 years ahead of me and had always been, in our family's unofficial hierarchy, the golden one. And me. I want to be fair about my parents. I want to resist the temptation that comes with hindsight to paint them as villains from the beginning, because the truth is more complicated and more painful than that. My mother was a practical woman who had survived a difficult life by making calculations. She had grown up poor, married someone she thought was going places, and spent 20 years slowly accepting that he wasn't. My father was charming and well-meaning and catastrophically bad with money, which is a combination that can hollow out a family over time in ways that are almost invisible, until they aren't. They loved me. I have to believe that. What they did was not the absence of love. It was love that had been so corroded by desperation and fear that it became unrecognizable. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The debt didn't start with one thing. It never does. It started with a series of small bad decisions that compounded over years into something crushing. My father had tried and failed at 3 different small business ventures, a hardware store that couldn't compete with the big box that opened 6 miles away, a landscaping company that he ran into the ground by extending too much credit to people who never paid, and a vending machine route that had seemed promising until the locations started dropping out one by one. Each failure left a scar on the family finances. Each scar was covered over with a loan or a credit card or money borrowed from people who weren't banks. By the time I was in high school, our house was mortgaged twice over. My parents were paying interest on interest. Kevin had been given money for college, a decision my parents made with a kind of desperate optimism, the belief that if Kevin got a degree and got out, he could eventually pull the rest of us up, and that money had come from places I didn't fully understand until much later. I didn't go to college. That was never the plan for me. Not explicitly, not cruelly. It was just understood. Kevin was the investment. I was the one who would help hold things together while the investment paid off. I graduated high school, got my waitressing job, started contributing to the household income at 18, and told myself that was fine. That my time would come. That there was a plan, even if nobody had ever sat down and explained it to me. There wasn't a plan. There was just debt, and the increasingly frantic management of it. The name I first heard connected to my family's finances was Harlan Doyle. I heard it the way you hear names in a house with thin walls, fragments of conversation, tones of voice, the particular weight that falls on certain syllables. Harlan. Harlan called. Harlan wants the payment by Friday. Don't tell Sarah about Harlan. Harlan Doyle was, by most public accounts, a success story. He was in his mid-50s, had made his money in private real estate development, buying distressed properties, converting them, selling them at enormous profit. He had an office in Pittsburgh and a house outside of it, on a piece of land that people in our area talked about the way people talk about places they'll never go. He wasn't a household name nationally, but in Western Pennsylvania circles, in the particular world of small city businessmen and local money, he was significant. He was the kind of man who got mentioned at Chamber of Commerce dinners and whose name appeared on the donor walls of the local hospital and art center. He was also, though this was less publicly discussed, the kind of man who lent money to people outside of conventional channels. Private loans, personal arrangements, the kind of financial relationship that doesn't have paperwork from a bank but does have consequences if you default. My father had borrowed from him a significant amount, I later learned, well into six figures, to try to stabilize things after the second business failure. Harlan had said yes because he and my father had a distant acquaintance through a mutual contact, and because Harlan, I would come to understand, had an eye for opportunities that weren't always the kind that showed up in investment portfolios. My father had been paying him back, slowly for years. But the interest had a way of keeping the principal alive. You paid, and the number barely moved. And at some point, around the time I was 21, my father had fallen significantly behind. I didn't know any of this clearly when my mother handed me that dress. I knew the outline. I knew we had money problems. I knew a man named Harlan was part of those problems. I didn't know the shape of what was coming. I put on the dress. I came downstairs. My father was in the living room in a button-down shirt that he reserved for church and funerals. My mother had changed too. Kevin wasn't there. Kevin was living in Pittsburgh by then, working at a company that did something with commercial insurance, doing reasonably well, not making enough to meaningfully help with the family debt, but enough to feel independent of it. There were fresh flowers on the dining room table. My mother had vacuumed. The good dishes were out. The cream-colored set with the gold rim that only appeared at Thanksgiving and Easter. "Who's coming to dinner?" I asked. "A friend of your father's," my mother said, not looking at me. "Be polite. Be pleasant. Don't bring up money." That last instruction landed somewhere in my chest with a quiet thud. Harlan Doyle arrived at 7 o'clock in a car that cost more than our house. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way of a man who had once been athletic, and now simply occupied space with authority. Silver-haired, well-dressed without being flashy, dark suit, no tie. The kind of casual formality that says I don't need to impress you. He had a way of moving through a room as if the room had been arranged for him specifically. He brought wine, a bottle of something I couldn't pronounce, and he handed it to my father with a two-handed grip and a smile that was warm and slightly off in a way I couldn't articulate. He was polite to my mother. He was expansive with my father, reminiscing about things I had no context for. And he was, from the moment he sat down at the table across from me, attentive to me in a way that I noticed and immediately set aside, because I was 22 and I had learned, working in a diner for 5 years, how to absorb that kind of attention without reacting to it. Dinner went on. My mother had made pot roast, which she did beautifully. There was conversation about the town, about the economy, about Kevin's job in Pittsburgh. Harlan asked me questions, what I did, whether I had plans, what I was interested in. He asked them the way a man asks questions when he already knows the answers and is watching to see if you'll confirm them. I answered carefully, the way I answered most things, keeping the door slightly open and giving away nothing I hadn't decided to give. After dinner, my parents suggested I go help in the kitchen. I went, and through the kitchen door, which didn't close all the way, I heard my father's voice drop to a register I associated with seriousness, and I heard Harlan's voice, measured, unhurried, and I heard 2 words clearly before my mother turned the faucet on. The girl. Just that. The girl. I stood at the sink with the water running and my mother's hands moving alongside mine, scrubbing dishes we both knew were already clean, and I understood in some cellular way that something had just been decided in the room behind me. I didn't know what, but I knew it involved me. And I knew my mother knew, because she wouldn't look at me, and she was scrubbing a pot that had been clean for 30 seconds. I didn't sleep well that night. Harlan came back the following Saturday. This time, just to see me. My parents framed it as him wanting to take me to lunch, show me around, get to know me. My father sat me down that morning and told me, with the careful articulation of a man delivering a speech he has rehearsed, that Harlan was a good man with a lot of opportunities, that he had taken an interest in me and wanted to offer me a chance that most people would never get, and that it would mean a lot to the family if I would go. What kind of chance? I asked. My father looked at the window. He'll explain, he said. Just listen. Keep an open mind. I want to pause here and tell you something I've had to work hard to understand about myself in the years since. I got in Harlan Doyle's car. I went to lunch with him. And I have asked myself 1,000 times why, and the answer is not flattering, but it is honest. Because I didn't yet believe that my parents had handed me to someone. Because that belief, if I had allowed it to form fully in that moment, would have destroyed something I wasn't ready to lose. The idea that my family was fundamentally safe, that whatever problems we had, however complicated and imperfect we were, the core of us was still intact. I wasn't ready to let go of that idea. So I went to lunch and I kept an open mind. Harlan took me to a restaurant in Pittsburgh that I had never been to and couldn't have afforded. White tablecloths. A menu with no prices. He ordered for the table without asking what I wanted, and I noticed that too, filed it, kept going. He talked. He was a good talker. Confident. Narrative. The kind of person who tells stories about themselves in a way that is intended to impress, but is calibrated to seem modest. He told me about growing up without money, about building what he had from nothing, about what he looked for in people and in properties and in situations. He used a lot of real estate metaphors, which I would later understand was not accidental. And then, over coffee, he said something that I still hear sometimes when I'm falling asleep. Your family is in a difficult situation, he said. Your father is a good man who made some mistakes. I don't hold that against him. But the debt is real and the terms are what they are, and I'm at a point where I need it addressed. He paused and looked at me directly. I'm also at a point in my life where I want something different. Not just professionally. Personally. I set my coffee cup down. I'm not looking for something inappropriate, he said, and the fact that he used that word, inappropriate, specifically, told me something. I'm looking for a companion. Someone intelligent, capable, presentable. Someone who would be willing to be a part of my life in an organized way. In exchange for which, the debt your father owes me would be cleared. In its entirety. The restaurant was quiet around us. Someone laughed at another table. A waiter moved past with a tray. You want me to? I started. Be part of my household, he said. Attend events with me. Be present. Over time, potentially, we see if there's something more genuine there. But I'm not demanding anything. I'm offering an arrangement. I was 22 years old. I had $800 in a savings account. My parents owed this man, by my later calculation, somewhere north of $140,000. I said I needed to think about it. He said of course. He drove me home. He walked me to the door, which my father opened before we reached it, and he shook my father's hand, and he left. And I stood in the doorway watching his car back out of our driveway. My father put his hand on my shoulder. It would help us a lot, he said. I turned and looked at him. And in that moment I saw it clearly for the first time. What had actually been assembled here? The dinner, the dress, the rehearsed speech. The introduction managed and choreographed. My father's hand on my shoulder, trembling slightly. The hand of a man who needed something from me and had run out of other options. I went inside. I went upstairs. I sat on my bed in the room where I had grown up and I cried, quietly, for a long time. And then I stopped crying, and I started thinking. Because here is what happened next, and this is the part that people don't expect when I tell the story. I called Kevin. Kevin, who was 5 years older and the family investment, and living in Pittsburgh, making decent money. Kevin, who I had not told about the debt. Who I suspected had not been told the full extent of it either. Kevin, who was my brother, the other person who had grown up in that house with those parents, who might or might not have known what had just been arranged for me. He answered on the third ring. Hey, he said. What's up? Did you know? I asked. Silence. Did I know what? He said. And I told him. All of it. The dinner, the dress, Harlan Doyle, the lunch in Pittsburgh. The arrangement. I told him in the flat, precise tone I used when I was trying not to fall apart, just moving through each fact in order. When I was done, Kevin was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How much is the debt?" I told him what I'd been able to gather. "Okay," he said. "Okay. Kevin, I know what they did," he said, and his voice had something in it I hadn't heard from my brother in years. Something hard and ashamed. "I know. Give me some time." He hung up. I sat there not knowing what that meant. I didn't sleep. In the morning I worked a breakfast shift at the diner, and I moved through it like I was watching myself from outside, taking orders, refilling coffee, smiling at regulars, while my actual mind was somewhere else entirely. 3 days passed. My parents didn't bring up Harlan. They didn't push. They moved around me carefully, my mother in particular, both of them behaving with the particular delicacy of people who have done something they know is wrong and are waiting to see if it will be confronted. On the third evening, Kevin called me back. "I talked to Mom and Dad," he said. And I yelled at them for a while," he said. "And then we talked about the actual situation." A pause. "The debt is real. It's bigger than you know. Harlan Doyle is not a patient man when he wants not to be. Dad has been scared for months." "I know," I said. "I can't cover all of it," he said. "I don't have that kind of money. But I've been talking to some people and I think I can cover a significant piece of it. Enough that we can restructure the rest through an actual bank." Something loosened in my chest. "Kevin." "Don't," he said. "Don't thank me. This should have been handled differently from the beginning. You should never have been put in that room with him." He paused again. "There's something else, though." I waited. When I talked to Dad, he told me some things about Harlan Doyle that I don't think you know. Things about why he's interested in this particular arrangement. "Sarah, I need you to be careful. This isn't just a lonely rich man looking for company." "What do you mean?" "I've been doing some digging," Kevin said. "Harlan Doyle has had previous arrangements. Similar ones. At least 2 that I can find. Young women in financially precarious situations, introduced through people who owed him. Both times the women were essentially isolated, moved into his property, cut off from their previous lives gradually. One of them got out after 18 months. The other one, I can't find much on her. She just kind of disappears from the record." The floor tilted in that way I was starting to recognize. "He's done this before," I said. "At least twice," Kevin said. "Maybe more. I talked to a woman named Sandra. She's the one who got out. She's not easy to find. She doesn't talk about it publicly. But she talked to me because she was worried when she heard his name again. Sarah, the way she described it, it starts as an arrangement. It seems almost reasonable at first, and then it just slowly becomes something else. He controls the money. He controls the access. He controls the narrative. By the time you realize what's happened, you're already inside it, and getting out is complicated." I sat with that information for a moment. "What about the debt?" I said. "I'm working on the money," Kevin said. "But it might take me 6 to 8 weeks to put it together properly. Until then, does Harlan know you haven't agreed?" I told him I needed to think. "Okay," Kevin said. "That buys some time. Don't agree. Don't refuse yet either. I know that's uncomfortable. But if you refuse outright and he calls in the debt, things could get bad very quickly for Mom and Dad." "Kevin," I said. "What kind of man is Dad to have done this?" Another long silence. "A desperate one," Kevin said finally. "A man who has been failing slowly for 20 years and finally failed completely and had a way out presented to him that he was weak enough to take. I love him. I don't know if I can forgive him yet, but that's what he is." That sentence, "a man who has been failing slowly for 20 years," landed somewhere deep, because I had grown up watching that slow failure without having a name for it. The hardware store, the landscaping company, the vending machines, the borrowed money, the careful maneuvering around what we didn't have. And at the center of it, my father, who was funny and warm and deeply, constitutionally unable to build something that lasted. I had loved him through all of it. I still loved him. And I was furious at him with a heat I had nowhere to put. I did what Kevin said. I called Harlan the next day and told him I was still considering his offer, that I had some questions, that I wanted to understand what the arrangement would look like practically. He was pleased by this. He suggested another lunch. I said I was working. Could we talk by phone? He agreed. We had a 30-minute conversation in which I asked careful questions and he answered them with the confidence of a man who expected everything to go his way. Meanwhile, Kevin was moving money. And I was doing something Kevin didn't know about. I was documenting everything. I had started, quietly and systematically, keeping records. Every conversation with Harlan, written down afterward in as much detail as I could manage. Every conversation with my parents about the situation. The dates, the words, the context. I wrote it all in a notes app on my phone and I emailed it to an account that only I knew about at the end of every day. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it. I just knew that I had been maneuvered without my knowledge or consent into a situation involving a man who had done this before, and I was not going to be without evidence if evidence ever became necessary. That instinct, the quiet, private decision to document, turned out to be the most important thing I did. 6 weeks in, Kevin had secured enough to make a significant payment on the debt. He contacted Harlan directly, which my father had not done because he was afraid to, and he had what Kevin described to me as a brief and unpleasant conversation in which Kevin made clear that the family was restructuring its financial obligations and that Harlan should expect formal payment and a restructuring proposal within 30 days. Harlan, apparently, was not pleased. He called my father first. My father called me and told me this in a voice that was doing everything it could to stay steady. He says the arrangement with you was part of the terms, my father said. He says the money alone isn't what he was owed. I sat with that for a moment. Dad, I said, was that in writing? What? Was there a contract? Anything written down that included me as part of the terms? A silence. No, my father said. It was just a conversation. I said, yes. Then legally? I said, and I was careful here, very careful. He's owed money. He's not owed me. There is no document that says otherwise. My father didn't say anything. Did you tell him I had agreed? I asked. Another silence. You told him I had agreed. I said, and it wasn't a question anymore. I told him that you were open to it, that we were all working toward. Dad, I said. Stop. I hung up. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the diner for 15 minutes. Then I called Kevin and told him what I'd learned, and I told him about the documentation I'd been keeping, and I told him I thought it was time to bring in outside help. What kind of outside help? Kevin asked. I talked to a legal aid office last week. I said. There are attorneys who deal with situations involving coercion and financial exploitation. I described the situation without using names. The attorney I spoke with said that what was being proposed, conditioning the resolution of a debt on a person agreeing to a personal arrangement with the creditor, without that person's informed, independent consent, that's potentially a form of trafficking, depending on how it's characterized. Kevin was quiet. I know that sounds extreme, I said. It doesn't sound extreme, he said. It sounds accurate. I'm not necessarily going to press charges, I said. I haven't decided. But I want Harlan Doyle to understand that I know what he's done, that I have documentation, and that if he pursues this beyond the financial debt, there will be consequences. Kevin said, I'm in. What do you need from me? What happened next took about 3 weeks and was simultaneously less dramatic and more significant than I expected. Kevin and I, with the help of a legal aid attorney named Patricia, who I will be grateful to for the rest of my life, sent a formal letter to Harlan Doyle. The letter outlined, in precise and careful language, the nature of the arrangement that had been proposed, the coercive circumstances under which it had been proposed, the documentation we had, and the reference to Sandra, the woman who had gotten out, who had agreed to be named in the letter, whose account corroborated a pattern. The letter made clear that the family intended to repay the financial debt in full, on a structured timeline, and that any further contact regarding any personal arrangement with Sarah would be treated as harassment. Harlan Doyle did not respond to the letter directly. His attorney did. The attorney's letter was brief and somewhat carefully worded in the way of attorneys who have been shown something they'd rather not have seen. It said that Mr. Doyle disputed the characterization of events, considered the financial matter to be a separate and legitimate concern, and had no further personal interest in any arrangement beyond repayment of the debt. In other words, he backed down. I want to be clear about what that meant and what it didn't mean. It meant I was out. It meant the personal threat was over. It did not mean justice, not in any formal legal sense. Harlan Doyle didn't face charges. He didn't face public exposure. He continued to exist in his world of properties and donor walls and Chamber of Commerce dinners. Patricia explained to me, with the weariness of someone who had explained this many times, that proving coercion in this kind of situation without a complaining witness willing to go through a full legal process was difficult, and that Sandra was not in a place emotionally to pursue that route, and that I had the right to make whatever choice felt right for my own life. I chose not to pursue formal charges. That decision is one I revisit sometimes, particularly on days when I'm feeling strong, wondering if I could have, done more. But I was 22 and exhausted, and I had just survived something that had required every ounce of whatever I was made of, and formal legal proceedings would have taken years out of my life that I wasn't ready to give. I made the choice that kept me intact. I stand by it, and I understand it, and I don't fully forgive myself for it either. What happened with my family is more complicated and took years to work through. Kevin paid down the debt significantly, a sacrifice that represented years of his savings and that I have never fully been able to express gratitude for. The rest was restructured through a real bank, at a real interest rate, with a real payoff timeline. My father, to his credit, stopped trying to manage money on his own and worked with a financial counselor for the first time in his life. He also, in a conversation I didn't expect and that I still find hard to talk about, sat me down and apologized. It was not a perfect apology. He didn't fully understand everything he had done, I think. He understood that he had been wrong. He understood that he had been weak. He said he had told himself that Harlan was a good man and that the situation would become something genuine, and that it wasn't what it looked like. He said he knew that those were things a person tells themselves when they have already decided to do something they know is wrong. He cried. My father, who I had almost never seen cry, put his face in his hands at the kitchen table and cried like a man who had been holding something for a long time. I didn't hold him. I wasn't ready for that. But I stayed at the table. I didn't leave. And that, at the time, was what I could manage. My mother was harder. My mother never cried about it, at least not in front of me. She acknowledged it in the way of a woman who survives by accepting the cold facts of situations and moving on. She said she had been afraid. She said she had believed, the way she always believed, that there was no other option. She said she thought it might have worked out, that Harlan might genuinely have been interested in something real. I looked at her across the table when she said that, might have been interested in something real, and I thought about Sandra, the woman who disappeared from the record, and I said, Mom, he's done it before. To other women. It doesn't work out. She absorbed that the way she absorbed most uncomfortable truths, going very still for a moment, and then readjusting, recalibrating, moving forward. Not denial, exactly. More like compression, taking the information and fitting it into the smallest possible space. I didn't know that, she said. I know you didn't, I said. And that was, for a while, as far as we could get. Now, here is where I need to tell you the part of this story that undoes the framework I'd built to understand it. About a year after all of this, when things had settled into a fragile but functional new normal, I'd left the diner and gotten a job as an office manager at a small construction company. I was saving money. I was going to community college in the evenings. I had found a therapist named Dr. Okonkwo who was helping me take apart what had happened and put it back in an order that made sense. I got a phone call from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't pick it up. I'd gotten into the habit of not answering unfamiliar numbers. But something made me answer. It was a woman. She said her name was Claire Doyle, Harlan's daughter. I said nothing for a moment. I thought about hanging up. Please don't hang up, she said, as if she had been expecting my silence. I know this is probably the last call you expected. I know who my father is and what he did, And I'm not calling to defend him. I'm calling because I found your name. How? I asked. Patricia, she said. Your attorney. She's worked with other women before. My father has. There are others. Not just the ones you know about. I've been trying to find them for the past 2 years, since I found out what he was doing. I sat down. I'm gathering documentation, Claire said. Real documentation. With the intention of making a case that can actually go somewhere. I've talked to a DA's office. They're interested, but they need complaining witnesses. Multiple ones. The more the better. She paused. I know it's a lot to ask. I know you've already been through it. But I thought you deserved to know that someone is trying to do something real about this. I asked her why. Why she was doing this, to her own father. She said, because he did this to my mother first. Before all of you. Before Sandra. Before anyone. My mother was 24 and her family owed him money, and she spent 8 years inside what he called a marriage before she got out. I grew up watching what that did to her. And I spent a long time pretending I didn't know what my father was. I don't want to do that anymore. The quiet that fell after those words was one of those silences that has a kind of weight to it. The weight of understanding finally settling into the right shape. Because here is the thing. The pattern wasn't accidental. It wasn't opportunism. It wasn't a lonely man looking for companionship. It was a system. A practiced, refined, deliberately constructed system that had begun with his own wife and extended outward from there. The debt. The introduction. The arrangement that started as a choice and became a capture. He had run it so many times that he'd gotten very good at it. He knew which families were vulnerable. He cultivated the debt. He staged the introduction. My family hadn't been unlucky. We'd been selected. That revelation. Sitting in my apartment with the phone at my ear and Claire Doyle's voice telling me the history that I had been a near miss in, rearranged everything again. Not the facts. The meaning of the facts. The difference between falling into a bad situation and being steered into one. I agreed to talk to Claire again. I agreed, after several more conversations and a long and careful talk with Dr. Okonkwo and with Patricia, to add my documentation to the file that was being assembled. I want to be honest with you about why. It wasn't courage, exactly. It was more like the recognition that choosing not to act had always felt like something I was doing to protect myself, and that was valid, and I didn't regret it. But now there was a structure. There was a group. There was a DA's office that was actually interested. There was Claire, who had grown up in the house where this had started, who was willing to stand up and name what she knew. The calculation was different than it had been when I was 22 and exhausted and alone. I added my voice. The case took 2 years to build. I won't walk you through every step of that. It was slow and grinding and bureaucratic, and there were moments when it seemed like it was going nowhere, and moments of sudden, startling momentum. What I'll tell you is the outcome. Harlan Doyle was charged with 3 counts of criminal coercion related to the women whose documented cases were clearest and whose testimony was strongest. I was one of them. The case went to trial. I sat in a witness box in a federal courthouse and I answered questions in a steady voice while Harlan Doyle sat at the defense table and did not look at me. He was convicted on 2 of the 3 counts. He is currently serving a 7-year sentence. His attorney appealed. The appeal was denied. That's the legal ending. But the real ending, the one that actually matters to me, is something different and smaller and harder to explain. It was a Sunday afternoon, about 6 months after the conviction, and I drove back to my parents' house. Not for a special reason, just because it was Sunday and I'd gotten into the habit, over the previous couple of years, of driving back once a month or so. The relationship with my parents is not what it was. It will never be what it was, because what it was included a layer of safety that turned out to be imaginary. But it's something. It's a work in progress. It's 2 people who did something unforgivable trying to be something better, and a daughter who is not fully there yet, but is not gone either. My father was in the backyard when I arrived. He was building a raised garden bed, wood and screws and a level, the way he used to build things when I was small, before the businesses and the debt took everything. His hands knew what they were doing. He looked older than I expected, the way fathers do when you see them outside the normal frame of memory. He looked up when he saw me come around the corner. And he didn't say anything. He just held out the level and asked if I could hold it steady while he drove in a screw. I took the level. I held it steady. We didn't talk about Harlan. We didn't talk about the dress or the dinner or the arrangement. We just built the garden bed in the Sunday afternoon light, my father and I, in that complicated, stubborn, imperfect way that families sometimes have of moving forward without being able to go back. My mother brought out lemonade. She set it on the porch railing and went back inside. Kevin came over later, with his girlfriend, who was kind and asked good questions and seemed to know enough about our family to tread carefully without making it awkward. We ate dinner. We talked about regular things. I drove home in the evening with the windows down, thinking about what it means to survive something. Not the dramatic version of survival, the triumphant, forward-marching version. The actual version. The version where the thing that happened to you is still inside you, is always going to be inside you, and the question isn't whether you get over it, but whether you learn to carry it in a way that leaves your hands free. I was 25 by then. I was finishing my associate's degree in business administration. I had a one-bedroom apartment that I paid for myself. I had a therapist and a couple of close friends and a cat named Gerald. Not after my father, I told myself, though I have never been entirely convincing on that point. I was not okay in all the ways that people mean when they say okay. But I was upright. I was moving. I was mine. That, in the end, is what they didn't manage to take. I am telling you this story not because I want your sympathy, though I understand if you feel it, but because I know there are people listening right now who recognize something in it. Maybe not the exact circumstances. Maybe you've never been handed to a stranger to settle a debt. But maybe you know what it is to have the people who were supposed to protect you make a calculation in which you were the cost. Maybe you know what it is to realize that a situation you thought you stumbled into was actually arranged for you by people or systems that were counting on your compliance. Maybe you know the particular exhaustion of surviving something that was never supposed to be survived because you were never supposed to figure it out. If you know that, any version of that, I want you to hear this. You are not the debt. You were never the debt. Whatever was owed, whatever was borrowed, whatever collapsed under the weight of someone else's failures, that was not yours to pay with your body, your freedom, or your life. And the fact that someone tried to make you pay it does not mean they were right about your worth. It means they were wrong about everything. I am 31 years old now. I work in operations management for a mid-sized company. I have a good life, not perfect, not without its own complications, but genuinely good in the way of things that were built carefully with your own hands. I have not forgiven everyone in the story. Forgiveness is a process, not a declaration, and I am still in the middle of it. But I am no longer afraid, and I no longer hold the level steady for people who don't deserve the steadiness. That took a while to learn. Most of the important things do. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe. There are more stories coming, and some of them will stay with you for a long time.